It is a beautiful day, albeit a little cool. It's interesting that what we'll be looking at this morning ties into what Greg was talking about. And it has to do really with our whole view of life. And we've talked about this a lot, but as human beings, we can either see life as an inexhaustible source of joy, of what we need, meeting the requirements that we have, or we can see it as a zero-sum game that there's only so much, and when that's gone, there's nothing left. And human nature tends to live over here in this place where you got to be real careful and watch out for what's yours. And as we look at Genesis 31, and we'll talk about some other things, Yeshua really dwelt on this a lot. And I'll mention this as we go on, and Greg kind of hinted at it. But Yeshua saw people as having the opportunity to live in the world the way it was built, or they could live in the kingdom. And a lot of us will read the stories about the kingdom when we put that out there. That's coming someday. Someday we're going to be in the kingdom. But if you're really honest with yourself and look at how he presents it, he wasn't talking about something to come. There is a prophetic fulfillment of the kingdom. But he expected you and me to live in a present reality. But he's always reminding us of tools that allow us to live there. And that's kind of what Greg was talking about. Because, you go back to what he started, the one example he gave of the feeding of the 5,000, and this actually happened a couple times in Yeshua's ministry. But he had the disciples gather up what they could, and it was a very small amount. It wasn't enough to feed 2 people. And yet, Yeshua wanted them to see that, and then he said, he blessed and passed it. We stick he blessed it, but what he really did was he blessed God. He thanked God for who he is, what he does. And God's resources are not limited by what we can see and what we believe is there. And if we live thinking that what we can see is the sum total of what we're going to enjoy, then we're going to be captured by the poverty of our own thinking. And as we look at Genesis 31, we have 2 people, Jacob and Laban, operating in this dynamic. And I'm going to read some of this. I won't read it all, but if you go to the first verse of Genesis 31, and I think it's important that when we look at these stories, we don't see those people as out there. These are pictures of us, or our neighbors, or what we can be or were. Now Jacob heard the words of Laban's sons, saying, Jacob has taken away all that was our father's, and from what belonged to our father he has made all this wealth. That kind of a statement is what I would call a adversarial or polarizing statement. He's saying, the Laban's sons are saying, Jacob has all this wealth, and he took it from our father. What am I supposed to take from that? Does Laban have enough, or is he going without? Is he starving? No, Laban has wealth too. One of the first things that you'll find out when you and I live in the world, not the kingdom, is that I look at everything you have as meaning that I don't have as much as I could. I look at your abundance and it impoverishes me. That is not the kingdom, because the kingdom says, Ron has that. That's wonderful. Thank God for what Ron has. But that's not natural, and it's not the world. We've got what? I can't remember what they have. Was it 2 fish and 5 loaves? Whatever it was. That's your vision. And so you start off with Laban's sons, and I find this interesting. They don't look at how God has blessed them and their dad. They look at how God has blessed Jacob, and they see that as detracting from them. And if you don't see how this impoverishes and destroys your spirit, you'll live here. And I think the interesting thing is when we back up, Laban's fabulously wealthy. They have more than enough. But they're letting Jacob's success bother them. Then it goes on to say Jacob could see their attitude had changed. And this is another thing that and I talk about this all the time in our political system. We've now developed a system where if you win, I lose. And if I win, you lose. There's nothing that says we win. And we don't realize you live in this to the point that you just have this adversarial, angry, competitive spirit, and it's not the kingdom spirit of abundance. You know, Greg talked about how do you teach kids to live abundantly? The example, that's true. Abundance doesn't come from what I have. It's how I live. Anyway, so Jacob, the Lord tells Jacob to return to the land of his fathers, and we always knew he was going to go to his inheritance. And he goes to his wives, and in verse 6 he says, "You know that I've served your father with all my strength, yet your father has cheated me and changed my wages 10 times. However, God did not allow him to hurt me. If he spoke thus, 'The speckled shall be your wages,' then all the flock brought forth speckled. And if he spoke thus, 'The striped shall be your wages,' then all the flock brought forth striped. Thus God has taken away from your father's livestock and given them to me." So when you hear to what Jacob's saying, there's this competition going on, and yet we can tell here that Jacob knows that it was not peeling those poplar branches that made the sheep bring forth speckled and striped, right? He did all that work, but who made the animals speckled and striped? God did. Jacob knows that. It still makes the previous chapter when he's doing all that with the poplars just, I don't get it. And it came about at that time, this is verse 9, about at the time when the flock were mating, that I lifted up my eyes and saw in a dream, and behold, the male goats which were mating were striped, speckled, and mottled. Then the angel of God said to me in the dream, "Jacob," and I said, "Here I am." He said, "Lift up now your eyes and see that all the male goats which you are mating are striped, speckled, and mottled. For I have seen all that Laban has been doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar, where you made a vow to me. Now arise, leave this land, and return to the land of your birth." And so Rachel and Leah said, "Do we have any portion or inheritance in our father's house? Are we not reckoned by him as foreigners? For he has sold us and has also entirely consumed our purchase price. Surely all the wealth which God has taken away from our father belongs to us and our children. Now then, do whatever God has said to you." And so Jacob arises, gets his kids' family together, and he takes off. And as they're leaving, Rachel steals Laban's household gods. Which, I love reading Bible stories because it makes me realize that just as dense as we are now, people were that dense then. Here's God giving them all this blessing, and she goes and steals Laban's gods. Do we do stuff like that? And then Jacob deceived Laban because he didn't tell him where he was going, that he was fleeing. And on the third day, Laban hears that he's gone. He chases after him. And when he gets there, close to Jacob's tent, the Lord comes to him and says, "Be careful that you do not speak to Jacob, either good or bad." In other words, the Lord's telling him, don't you do anything. So Laban comes and he's angry with Jacob. In a very real sense, he's right to do this. I pointed this out before. When I find myself needing not to tell you the full truth of what I'm doing, there's something in me that's afraid of what you'll say or you'll do, or that by saying this, I will expose my true motive and I'll have to change what I'm about to do. Have you ever noticed that you'll get to a place where you've made a decision and you don't want to be bothered with alternatives? You've made up your mind. And God could put a donkey in front of you and talk to you, and what would you say? Get out of the way, you dumb donkey. I mean, I love the story about Balaam because, again, this is our nature. And Laban and Jacob are both right to be kind of angry with each other. It ends up all right. They build this big mound and say this will be a witness between the two of us. And Laban gets after him for stealing his gods, and Jacob doesn't have any idea Rachel has done this, and he says, well, you go find your gods, and the person will die, whoever stole your gods. Well, he goes through everything, and you can just tell as he's going through Jacob's stuff what's happening with Jacob. He's getting madder, and he's getting madder, and he's just seething. This is my stuff, and also, I know I didn't steal the gods. Well, Jacob sits down and doesn't move because she's sitting on the gods, and she tells her dad, well, pardon me for not moving. I'm in the way of women, so I can't move. The whole thing is just, when I look at how relationships with people are complicated when we start to massage the truth, deceive, lie. Have you ever noticed that one little lie never ends there? Because then there has to be another lie. I mean, I've told you many times, I notice in the cattle industry, it still happens some, but it makes a big difference when an animal is born if you're going to show it. And so what would happen when people would see a real good one that was born early, which would make it bigger, they would change the date of birth. This was fairly common. You know, it was actually born, this happened in Utah once, and this animal went all-American. But the animal was actually born in April, and it was represented as being born in July. The problem is, when you lie, you've got to make sure you lie about everything. Because there's a record of when the cow calved. There's a DHI record on production that says, you know, and here you have this cow with a milk weight before this calf was born. Anyway, these people lost the All-American. I mean, it was just a big mess. And I always thought about it. You know, I've heard people say how much it costs sometimes to be honest. And it can. I mean, if you're honest, you walk out of the store, the clerk gave you $20 too much, you're going to go back and give it back. But if you ever stopped to think how much easier life is if you just tell the truth all the time. Then you never have to worry about, what did I say? Who did I tell this lie to? and you see here that Laban deceives Jacob, Jacob deceives Laban, and so they're all kind of angry with each other. And then another thing I've noticed very strong is they keep telling each other that what you have is mine. And there's this anger. Anybody here that ever raised children, did you notice that the sense of belonging and ownership starts early? And it's not all bad, don't misunderstand me. But, I mean, one of the classic things I noticed, and I'm sure I never did it. The thing is, I don't know about you, I can't remember anything about being a child. I know I was one. But I'd watch my kids playing, and I can remember, and I think it could have been Ben, of course they all did it, but he had like 2 trucks and a tractor, and he was playing with one truck. And David walked in, wanted to play with something, and Ben said, no, they're mine. Get your own. And all right now, you have to share, and we've all gone through this. But anybody here have to teach your kids to be selfish? It was fairly natural. And this thing, that's mine. Well, it's not all bad, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But when you look at this story, Laban and Jacob keep saying, it's mine, it's mine. And, you know, there's this thing that if I give you what's mine, I'm going to be less. I mean, you stop to think about it. In the example I just gave, the one child has already got what they're playing with, but you can't take that one because I'll be less. That diminishes me. That takes from me. And it's natural, but when we talk about the world and the kingdom, that's the way we respond in the world. When we're looking and they're saying, There won't be enough. You see, if you're thinking like Yeshua, and he sees 2 fish and 5 loaves, what does he see? Enough food to feed 5,000 people. And then what? Was there 12 baskets of each left? Or something. I mean, it was a picture of abundance, like Greg said. That's what it was. But in this story, I'm going to start with verse 36. Then after Laban's gone through all Jacob's stuff and hasn't found what he's looking for because Rachel's sitting on it. Then Jacob became angry and contended with Laban. Jacob said to Laban, "What is my transgression? What is my sin that you have hotly pursued me? Though you have felt through all my goods, what have you found of all your household goods? Set it here before my kinsmen and your kinsmen, that they may decide between us two. These 20 years I have been with you, your ewes and your female goats have not miscarried, nor have I eaten the rams of your flocks. That which was torn of beasts I did not bring to you, I bore the loss of it myself. You required of my hand, whether stolen by day or stolen by night. Thus I was, by day the heat consumed me, and the frost by night, and my sleep fled from my eyes. These 20 years I have been in your house. I served you 14 years for your 2 daughters, and 6 years for your flock, and you have changed my wages 10 times. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had not been for me, surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed. God has seen my affliction and the toil of my hands, so he rendered judgment last night." Then Laban replied to Jacob, "The daughters are my daughters, and the children are my children, and the flocks are my flocks, and all that you see is mine." Is that true? That's not true. And I laugh. But what can I do this day to these daughters, to these my daughters, or to their children whom they have borne? In other words, I'm not going to do anything. These are all mine, but out of the goodness of my heart, you can have them. Jacob paid for all of it. Something I want to point out to you, and I mentioned it last week, but it's come to me very often, because maybe the Spirit's addressing something in my character. When you're keeping books, it's because you're in a relationship where you're not loving. Did you notice Jacob knew everything that he had done for Laban? He listed it. He listed how many years. He listed everything he went through, how many times Laban changed his wages. He knew all that. Are you aware of a verse that says love keeps no record of wrongs? I would like you to go up to a mother who's raised a family and ask her what she did for her children. And she is not going to know. She's not going to be able to tell you, well, 3,000 nights I got up and cleaned up throw up. 520 times I changed messy diapers. No. Do they know? They don't know because they don't care. They love, and so they do. There's something about when we love, it lets go of this poverty mentality, how much I have. And Jacob and Laban, they want to love each other, but they don't know how because they're so busy counting up what they have and making sure you don't take anything. And here's the amazing thing. God blessed them both. They had plenty. They had plenty. But instead of rejoicing in what they had, they were diminished by the abundance of someone else. They put this witness heap and they say, will neither of us ever go past this witness heap to harm the other. This pile of rocks. So Laban goes back home and Jacob goes to his country. And it says in the last verse of the chapter, early in the morning Laban arose, kissed his sons and his daughters, and blessed them. Then Laban departed and returned to his place. I think it's interesting that when we look at Scripture and how it tells us to live, that very often we can't even see ourselves and see how much we live in this place of limited resources. We live in this place where we obsess and worry about what we have instead of being thankful for what we have. And you'll notice in the story with Yeshua and the 5,000, he blessed, he thanked. And this opened up the gates of heaven. And I like what Greg talked about, this expectation. And there are realities. We need to be bigger, I think. God knows more than I suppose. But do I want to live in expectation of what God will do? Then I thank God for what I have. And when I see somebody else prospering, it fills me with joy what God has done for them. But if I look at someone else prospering and I feel diminished, then I move over here in this place of the zero-sum game. And when you look at Jacob and Laban, I mentioned this over and over, but they see each other as competitors. They see each other as competing for possessions, for love, and they definitely are counting up. They're keeping books. They're keeping score. You better ask yourself, if there's anybody on the face of the earth that you're keeping score, you're keeping a record of your relationship with them, then you have moved out of the kingdom and you're in this place where there's no love. It's just not, in love you don't do that. If Jesus counted the cost in redeeming me, would he do it? It says he didn't count the cost. Because love, I almost said trumps. Trump has become a scary word. But so I was thinking about this quite a bit, and I mentioned this earlier. All of us remember that when John the Baptist came, the first thing he said as he brought his ministry to Israel in those days, largely the Jews, repent, the kingdom of heaven is near, or is at hand. And then a chapter later, it records that Yeshua came and said the same thing. The kingdom is coming. And if you look at this, a lot of people who are biblical scholars, but they're not believers. And I don't know if you ever read these kind of books. I do. I don't suggest it unless you kind of, I like philosophy, so I'm curious what they think. But a lot of people say, what a hum. They said the kingdom was coming, it never came. Israel was banished and exiled, and it's just like they laugh at Jeremiah 33 that David will always have a man on the throne and Levi will always have a... Nah, you can see it didn't happen. Shows you how silly these prophecies are. There's another way to look at it, of course. But one of the things that I think is important to note is what I said earlier. Because of reading the Bible from our viewpoint, many of us don't understand when Yeshua uses the word the kingdom or the kingdom of heaven, we Christians are immediately going to heaven. But most of the time when he talks about the kingdom of heaven, he's talking about a present day reality that God has enabled you and me to live in. And how do I know that? In the Sermon on the Mount, see, I've read a lot of people that read the Sermon on the Mount and they say, well, this is silly, this is impossible, this is utopian. This will never happen till Yeshua comes and he's on the throne. So, in other words, don't worry about that, because it's got awful stuff in there like loving your enemies and, that kind of stuff. Well, remember what he said in the Lord's Prayer? Your kingdom come, where? On earth or in earth as it is in heaven. So you stop and you think, well, everything he said about the kingdom, he was saying, I expect that to be your reality today. If he said, I've come that you might have life and that more abundantly, he wasn't talking about heaven. Not that it won't be that way. But you know what's interesting? As Christians, we got to the place where we are more concerned about heaven than the world we're on. And if you look at the Bible, is God sending us to heaven? No. What's the last chapter in the Bible about? It's bringing heaven to earth. The book of Revelation that describes the New Jerusalem, where is it? It's on this earth. It's a new heaven and a new earth. But all that just to say, there's a reality in the kingdom that's now. And God gives us principles. It's just like what Greg talked about today is very much, and I think he talked about this a couple weeks ago. Inasmuch as you're prepared what? Receive. he was talking about shoveling snow, and I was laughing when he was talking about it because my dad loved to shovel snow. He loved to shovel snow. I saw Dad out there when he was 95 shoveling snow. He liked it. But Greg made a very good point. If you like to shovel snow, what do? You make sure you have the implements you have, and if you want to clear the sidewalk, all the stuff that he's done to get the snowblower, but all that, if you really like to do it, you prepare. Would you think that it's possible, if you and I want to live in the kingdom and enjoy the kingdom principles, you think we would prepare to live that way? It means when we look at Jacob and Laban that we can go, they're our forefathers, we bless them, but we don't want to live there. There's something about this selfish, grasping, conniving. Because have you ever thought about it? If you think there's plenty to go around, you're always going to be glad when you see somebody has it. But if you're frightened that there may not be enough for you, when you see somebody with plenty, then you see that as taking it away from you. And just a couple more times, speaking of the kingdom, the Pharisees, they came to him, they said, because he talked about the kingdom, they said, when's the kingdom coming? And listen to what Yeshua said. The kingdom of God is not coming with signs to be observed, nor will they say, look, here it is, or there it is. For behold, the kingdom of God is in your midst. Or I think the King James says, the kingdom is in you. In Matthew 12, he said another interesting thing. He cast the demons out of somebody, and they got after him saying, well, you're casting out demons by Beelzebub, the prince of demons. And Yeshua says, wait a minute, a house divided itself cannot stand, and all that thing about Satan deals with Satan's kingdom and God with his. But he makes this statement, if I cast out demons by the Spirit of God, then the kingdom of God has come upon you. This means when Greg was communicating to us and saying, I feel that the Spirit told me this. What was Greg saying? He was saying, I went over here in the kingdom. I went over where the king sat on the throne and I said, Jesus, Yeshua, what are you saying today? And what was Jesus saying? It's good, it's bountiful, I have plenty. It's going to be great. I think it amazes me. I read the Sermon on the Mount, and I actually memorized Matthew 5. And I don't know, was it Kaya? Somebody has memorized Matthew 5 through 7, which I thought was a lot. What I find when I memorize a chapter, if I don't repeat it almost every day, there are some things that are diminishing. My memory would be one of those. But when I memorized this chapter, one of the first things I noticed is that Yeshua keeps saying that if you do this, you'll inherit the kingdom. If you do this, you'll be in the kingdom. He says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And then he says, he says, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. And I thought, well, is being meek different? Then I realized that to Yeshua, to inherit the earth is to have the kingdom of heaven. He's not making these two distinctions. That's what we do because we've separated earth and heaven. And I'm going to read you a passage it's in Luke, but it's very similar to the Sermon on the Mount. It's in Luke 6. And I don't know about the rest of you. I know in my own nature, I'm cheap. A lot of you may not be cheap. I'm cheap. And growing up here at Estelle didn't help. But I blamed the community for my own personality. Joy's not here, so I dare tell this. On our honeymoon, when I got our motel, I looked for the cheapest one and got one for $8 a night.
Whoa!
It was a dive. It is only the good grace of God that Joy has forgiven me. I'm so embarrassed when I think about that place. But I'm always thinking, well, if I spent $5 more on that room, than I needed to, I've wasted money. No, that's not true. And when you watch over your pennies and you act like this is something that's so painful and dear, you hold it to yourself, it keeps you out of the kingdom. The kingdom is a place of prosperity and there's plenty. But I know this about me. I had to learn because, we didn't have money when I was growing up. And when we had $1 or $2, that's a lot of money. I remember Alan and I used to go trapping, and we'd have to pay for the gas in the vehicles. And one of the vehicles we took was an old dump truck that I bet it got 5 miles to the gallon if you're lucky. But we'd go trap something, go through all that work, sell the fur, and, get $5. And I can remember thinking, that's a lot of money. And you work so hard to get it, but there's this thing that happens where we think the money is ours, and money isn't yours. It's in your hands. And you should be careful with it. But here's one of the things I started to notice when I grew up, left the community for a while. I noticed that people that were generous with money had more money than the people that were so careful. And I still notice this. You go out to eat somewhere and there's some people you can't stop. They want to pay for everybody all the time. In fact, you've learned you got to pay quick. Pay for theirs before they pay for yours. Then there are other people, they'll never buy a thing for anybody. And you just get to where you learn that. It's not a good picture of the kingdom. It's not. Joy and I had an interesting experience going to town Wednesday morning. Remember, the wind was blowing real hard, and it was in the mid-50s because our car told us, like 57. And we came over that you come up the cedars, the junipers, and you drop off that first little hill down into that valley just before you crest the top of Kings. And I think it's about the 21-mile marker. There was a fellow out there walking with these nasty dreadlocks. Oh. But he had a t-shirt and sweatpants on and a gallon of gas in his hand, and he was walking east. Joy was driving because I had been a little tired. And she shot by and he said, "Honey, turn the car. I don't like the looks of this." So she turned around and we came back, and I said, "Where are you going and what's going?" "Oh, my car ran out of gas." "How did you get at the 21-mile marker walking east with a gallon of gas in your hands?" Well, somebody had picked him up, taken him to the border, and he had been walking for, 5 or 6 hours. How long would it take you to walk 21 miles? And I took one look at him, and I'm like, "Get in the car." And I took him up to his car. We took him to his car. It was this little gas can, barely over a gallon. And he said, I said, "Which way are you going?" He says, "I'm going east." And I said, "A gallon of gas isn't going to get you to Delta. No, it's not happening." So I said, "You need to drive back to the border and fill your car, and then you can go on." "Oh, I don't have money." And very apologetic, not trying to get it. And he's freezing to death. He's skinny as a rail. I have no idea what's going on. So I said, "Well, here's an apple," and I gave him some money. Well, I get back in the car and I look around, and Joy has gotten all the carrots she'd just cut, and she's given those to him and given him more money. And he was in tears. He gave Joy a hug. And I have no idea what was going on with him, but I was thinking, we gave him some money. There were days when I would have thought I gave away the farm. But you know what? We'll never miss that money. It's money. God gives you money to give it away. When you can't use your money to bless people, and I've been there, it owns you. You don't own it. And I get a little chuckle when I think about that young man, and I'm thinking, he's running away from home or running back home. I don't know what's going on. But when Joy gave him that other $20 and the carrots, just the instinctive, he gave her a hug and the tears in his eyes, I thought, I don't care about the money. And you start thinking, I hope it does him some good. I used to do this too. I'm not going to give them money. They're going to buy liquor with it or drugs, or that's not your problem. You're using that excuse because you love the money in your pocket. I like what Gerald does. He has a huge raft of dollar bills and $5 bills. And when somebody's sitting on the corner of the street with their hand out, he drives up, gives them money, and drives on. Sadly, I have to admit, I think he does this because of what he grew up with. They were a little tight. You may not have been around, but it was interesting. Let's go to Luke 6. I think it's interesting, and certainly we don't want to tell other people what to do. But what I am discovering is that, like I said before, being generous with things and with money opens the pipeline of heaven. But don't do it for that reason, or it won't. Do it because you love to bless, because there's plenty. And where that came from, God has more. Luke 6:27, but I say to you who hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. Whoever hits you on the cheek, offer him the other also. And whoever takes away your coat, do not withhold your shirt from him either. Give to everyone who asks of you, and whoever takes away what is yours, do not demand it back. Treat others the same way you want them to treat you. Can you see the complete diametric opposite that is to Laban and Jacob? It's like two different worlds. They're so careful, they're so worried, they're deceiving each other, they're checking their fingers after they shake. I mean, everything is so suspicious. And here's Yeshua saying, give it away. If they want your coat, give them your overcoat. I mean, I'm like, that's not wise. I might be cold. I think there's wisdom involved, but I do think that Yeshua is saying there's a way to tap in to the kingdom, to the abundance that Greg talked about. And one of the ways is to open the spigot on your end. There's something that keeps us tight. And I speak from experience. I have a stingy personality. I would like to blame my parents. I'd like to blame Eskel. A lot of things I'd like to blame. Nope, it's me. That's who I am. And I've had to learn. And what I've discovered is doing things God's way has blessed me immeasurably. And I haven't become poor by giving away. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. If you lend to those from whom you expect to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners in order to receive back the same amount. But love your enemies and do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. And your reward will be great. Where? In the kingdom. Here, now. And you will be sons of the Most High, for he himself is kind to ungrateful and evil men. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Pardon, and you will be pardoned. Give, and it will be given to you. They will pour into your lap a good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over. For by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you in return. I'm going to read some from Matthew 6, which is the same part, and talk about something. It's a Hebrew idiom, speaking of the good eye and the bad eye. Matthew 6:19, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in or steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And see, Jerry alluded to this in the writings, where it talked about laying up treasure in heaven. What does that mean? And I used to wonder, that just means in the kingdom what Yeshua has been saying. If you're merciful, mercy will pour down on you. The eye is the lamp of the body. So then if your eye is clear, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light that is in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. Now, this is the same story, but it's in Luke. Right after Yeshua said this, in Luke 16, now the Pharisees who were lovers of money were listening to all these things and were scoffing at him. And he said to them, if you are those who justify themselves in the sight of men, but God knows your hearts. For that which is highly esteemed among men is detestable in the sight of God. You all know this in 1 Timothy 6:10, for the love of money is a root of all sorts of evil. And some by longing for it have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. What I didn't know till I looked in this is lovers of money or love of money is one word in Greek. And what it really means is you love silver. It's phileo. If you know chemical symbols, Ag is silver. So it just means lovers of silver, lovers of gain. And I think there's an interesting thing to look at. Yeshua says that a good eye, your body will be full of light. A bad eye, your body will be full of darkness. Well, it says in the King James a single eye. And you had a lot of people would read that and they'd say, oh, Yeshua is telling us we should do transcendental meditation. That we should concentrate. Well, that's probably not bad if you want to meditate. But a single eye or a good eye means to be generous. And what Yeshua is saying is a generous person is full of light. Why? Because a giver, light comes into them. A bad eye is to be stingy, clinging, avaricious, somebody who is acquisitive, someone who's worried, and he says, you're full of darkness. Now, here's an interesting thing. Do you all know what a black hole is in the universe? Let me read the description. A black hole is a place in space where gravity pulls so much that even light cannot get out. Did you hear that? A black hole is a place so dense and the pull is so incredibly strong that light can't escape. Now that's an interesting thing because what are we called to be? Light. Let your light so shine. And I thought, when I'm greedy or when I'm careful protecting myself, Yeshua says I'm full of darkness. I'm like this black hole. The gravity is so strong because matter has been squeezed into a tiny space. This can happen when a star is dying because no light can get out. People can't see black holes. They are invisible. And I thought, what an interesting picture. A star is dying. What happens to us when we see everything as for us, we need it, it's got to be ours, we become protective, is we become a dying star. It's just an interesting picture when Yeshua says that a good eye is to be full of light. And you think about light. If you come into a pitch black room and even just turn on a flashlight, the beam of that flashlight will go through the darkness immediately. No darkness can withstand light. But the darkness that pulls in, and I think you could almost put self in front of anything that leads us into this black hole, but selfishness, self-pity, you name it. Anything that gets us focused in on ourselves, turns us in on ourselves, it makes us dark. It destroys our spirit. And Yeshua is saying here that to be generous, to be giving, to be flowing out, fills us with light. And can you imagine a greater promise than this one? What did I do with that? Give and it will be given to you. They will pour it into your lap, a good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over. For by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you in return. What an incredible picture. I'm going to read you a story of two brothers, and this is one of those stories that's very, very ancient. It has all kinds of supposed attribution. We won't fight over that because we don't know the story is great. It shows us what we're talking about here. Once two brothers shared a large farm. One brother was married and had several children. The other was single and lived alone. They shared the work equally, and they shared the fruits of the harvest equally as well. But each had his own home, and each had his own barn. One year the harvest was so good that each brother's barn was filled to the top with the harvest that God had given them. One night, soon after the harvest, the older of the two brothers said, "My poor younger brother, he has to feed his wife and children. It's not fair that he and I each get the same amount of the harvest. He needs the grain more than I." That very night, he took a sack of grain from his own barn and walked across the fields to put it in the barn of his brother. That very same night, the younger brother said to himself, "My poor older brother, he has no family to take care of him. When he gets old, he will have no one to help him, and his work to help him with his work and to help feed him. It is not fair that we each get the same amount of the harvest. He needs the grain more than I." He also took a sack of grain from his own barn and walked across the fields to put it into his brother's barn. Imagine the surprise of each brother when the next morning came. Each gave away a sack of grain, yet each had the same amount left the next morning as he had the night before. Night after night, the brothers crossed the fields with the gift of love for each other. God must have smiled at the love and respect the two showed each other. Then one night, the moon shone brightly. As the two brothers crossed the fields, each saw the other. They dropped their loads and ran to embrace each other. It is said the very spot where the two embraced that night was where the great temple was built in Jerusalem. And we don't know that. But there's something beautiful about that when you stop to think about it. When we, I love the scripture that Jerry mentioned is it 2:16 that talks about consecration? That says, "Let every man's ability be a storehouse for the needy." Is it 2:17? I don't remember which one. I think it's verse 17. Whatever. But I was thinking about that when we live to make sure people have what they need, God will take care of us. And again, I'm not saying we shouldn't be wise, but I do think there's something in us, and I loved how Greg put it because I found myself agreeing with what he was saying in my natural self, that how silly is it to think that God will take 2 fish and 5 loaves and feed 5,000 people? That's utterly stupid. But if I choose to live there, I'm never going to see the abundance of the kingdom. I'm never going to see what we read in Luke 6, where Yeshua says, if you give, it will be given back to you, pressed down, overflowing. And I don't know about you, I'm so thankful that God is in my heart, that the Spirit is in me. But I find myself at a place where I want to live the principles of the kingdom so I can enjoy what God has promised to me. And I don't want to put this off till who knows what AD. I think that's for us now. And I do love the picture of these two brothers, but the little story does show us something, that when we love, we're going to find ourselves giving. And as we give, it will be poured out to us. It is a significant thing to me that when you look at the Bible, tithing is a principle that both Jews and Christians look at a little differently. But in the end, both groups of people believe that 10% of their income is to go toward helping others. Build take care of the sanctuary. And I don't know about you, and I don't want this to come across in a negative sense, and it will somewhat, but just want to point something out, that your worldview will change how you give. We've all seen the wreckage that's happened in Syria, Aleppo, and these places where people have been bombed out of their homes, they have no place to go home, the rape, the murder, and the tremendous need of a place to go. Isn't it interesting to you that the lion's share of these people are Muslims. And name me a Muslim country that has opened its borders to one refugee. I thought it was interesting. Saudi Arabia has literally hundreds of thousands of places for people to stay that they keep for pilgrims who come to Mecca and Medina. But they couldn't handle a refugee, but they would put up the money to build them a mosque in Europe. I thought it was kind of an object lesson for me to think, James deals with, I think it's John that says, if you love, don't tell people. Maybe it is James. Who says, don't tell your brother to be warmed and filled? It's one of those two. Is it James? Whatever the case. In other words, give them a meal and put a coat on their back. Don't. And in the world today, we have two countries that when there is a tragedy, when there is a cataclysm, when there is what we call acts of God, these two countries have people there immediately with medical help, food. You know who these two countries are? Israel and the U.S. Why? Sometimes people don't see that this comes from the Word of God that's been planted in us, that sometimes we don't even know where this comes from. But this need to help, this need to give away, this need to take care of people. Do you ever stop to realize how many people live in the nation of Israel? There aren't 15 million. You know how many people live in China? How many live in India? How many live in Russia? Here's a point that I have, and I don't want to be ungracious about it. The countries that give are blessed. I was looking at giving in America, and I noticed that, and this is very true, the poorest sectors of society are not the most giving. And yet there are notable exceptions. They said when you do these surveys, you'll find there are people that almost have nothing that give away 30% of their income. But as people get a little more, you see this generosity increase. But as a nation, the level of giving always hovers between 2.5% to 3.5%. And I thought that was interesting. This is just so you can be mad at people. Conservatives tend to give more than liberals and religious more than non-religious. I'm not sure I'll share that in Baker. But seriously, what you find is that very generous people come from all walks of life. But that the impulse to give, the impulse to share, that the belief that there is plenty, the belief that God doesn't have a finite amount of resources, that if we give, if we bless, that He has infinitely more to replace what we've given away. And that really within us, when we look at these scriptures, because, most people read what Yeshua has to say in the Sermon on the Mount, and they literally don't believe that is something they should even try. I thought about this, because He links this giving with loving your enemies, and He says, listen, bless people. Your father blessed you and you weren't anything great. There's something in us that it sounds too illogical. It sounds a little scary. And another thing I've noticed, growing up here in the community, we didn't have a lot of money, and we really didn't. I think you're all aware of that. I can remember, I always had plenty to eat. I always had a roof over my head. But I do remember eating bread that the rocks had gotten in the wheat. And so when you took a bite, it gritted. And I also remember when we couldn't afford butter, the cows weren't milking right then, and so we just put straight molasses on our bread. When I think back on it, it sounds awful. I was happy. It was okay. I wasn't eating a lot of bread. But I've noticed that in the last few years, God has really blessed us a lot. We've been very blessed. We're very well taken care of. But sometimes I don't know if we share with our people how much our organization gives away. I mean, Johnny has felt that it was the right thing to do to give what he called a first fruits offering, and I think it was the equivalent of what a load of hay was worth, which was several $1,000s, and we gave it to a ministry. We give right now thousands of dollars. Remember David Rubin, who was here, who takes care of the children who have been traumatized in terrorist attacks? We give them thousands of dollars. We're helping Frank Houts with his school that he's developing. Barry and Batya Siegel, who have a ministry of feeding the poor, the downtrodden, Holocaust survivors in Jerusalem. We give them money. And you know, I don't do this to make us sound good. I'm telling you that we do this because it's what God asks us to do. You have to be careful because you are called in Scripture to take care of your own. In fact, it says he who neglects his own is worse than an unbeliever. But on the other hand, I have never seen generosity unrewarded by God. And I think we can be grateful that we as an organization have become a very giving group, that we try to bless. I found for myself, I need to do it myself personally. I'm uncomfortable telling people what they should do individually, but I am going to say this: giving needs to be part of your life. The money that you get, if you see that as yours and you hang to it tightly, you cling to it, it will possess you instead of you possessing it. And we all do things differently. I know Joy and I, we pay tithing on what we get from the community, and then Joy is a problem when it comes to generosity. And actually, God blessed me with Joy because of my personality that tended to be abstemious, to use a big word. She gives to this ministry and to that ministry. And you know what I've noticed? We always have plenty of money to do what we want. We sure could have more. I mean, I've thought about, here's the funny thing I've noticed about when you love money. If you're a lover of money, as it describes in the Scripture, and it's used several times, how much money is enough? We all know the answer to that, don't we? If money is what I love, there isn't enough. 1,000, 10,000, a million, there isn't enough. But if God is my supply, and I've got a roof over my head, clothes on my back, and food to eat, I'm a rich person indeed. And I just have to thank the Lord how He has blessed us. And I agree with what Greg was saying. God's wanting us to be filled with expectation of the abundance that He wants to bring us. People, things, joy. I don't see God as a God of lack. He's a God of good things. And we're coming to this week of Thanksgiving. Every week can be a week of Thanksgiving, but it's an especially good time to just count our blessings, and we have been richly, richly blessed. Let's all stand. Sister Pam, would you close for us, please?
Whoa. It is really great to experience your day that you've set aside for us, Lord. Thank you for the provision that you've made for us, for the music, the teaching, and the sharing with each other. We just ask that we go with an open mind and an open spirit through the rest of this day so that we can accumulate the love that you want to pour into us. We just give thanks in Yeshua's name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. I keep looking up there and thinking, something's wrong. That's the different clock. I never notice anything unless you change it. Then I'll notice it.